Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Superfeeler podcast. My name is Laurie, and I'm joined today by Dave and Megan for our DBT Skills session. Again, if you are new to this series, you might want to go back and start at square one. You don't have to, though. It's you can just pick whatever skill you want to learn. We're kind of going through this beautiful book, DBT for Life by Diana Partington, to help us go through the various skills, just kind of refresh our memory. So all of us have gone through dialectical behavior therapy before. We all live with borderline personality disorder, but we forget skills sometimes. And everybody has their own way of remembering skills and using them. So these conversations have been really interesting. So today we're at one of my favorite skills, which is Dear Man. Although in this book, it's actually just called The Dear. And I'm not sure why that was, but whatever, that's fine. So I'm going to call it Dear Man just for my own brain. Or else I'm going to start getting confused. So the dear part of Dear Man is kind of the steps to have a conversation that's productive. And they say, get what you want. I've never loved that wording because given the misconception that we're intentionally manipulative and all that stuff, it kind of feels gross to me. But at the end of the day, it's really about it is kind of about getting what you want, or at least knowing what you want and trying to communicate that effectively. The DEAR, again, I said in the last episode, Marsha loves acronyms. Marsha created this therapeutic modality. So describe the facts, express your emotions, assert what you want, and reinforce the other person for giving you what you want. So describe, express, assert, and reinforce. I use this skill a lot, and I talk about this a lot on various podcasts that I'm on, and it's probably one of my top 3 skills, would be my guess. Before we kind of get into the meat of the conversation, I just want to summarize. So if you are new to this series, the book has a really beautiful way of talking through skills, in that the beginning of each chapter starts with a story that is kind of based on the writer, Diana, her clinical experience as a counselor, and stories that she's heard throughout her time working with clients. So this story is called The Cupcake Committee. So we've got a beautiful image here of this beautiful woman with cupcakes. They look delicious. So Lola is definitely struggling with some anger management issues and some kind of behavioral issues throughout her life, but she's trying really hard to use DBT and work through them. And she has a conflict at school with this one individual over and over and over again, where he's basically physically assaulting her. So he's kind of constantly hitting her and touching her, and she's feeling really uncomfortable about it. And because of how uncomfortable she feels about it, it has escalated to the point where they've both been suspended at least once. And so her goal for therapy on this particular day is to try and figure out how I can get him to stop hitting me or touching me. And so what they're using is the Dear Man skill, which I think is a brilliant skill in this context. So trying to describe what this person is doing in a strictly factual way. And so I really liked how talked about overgeneralization here, because she goes he's always touching me. And the counselor goes is he always touching you? He literally just walks behind you and pokes you all day. And she's well, not always, but you know what I mean. And that's one of the really important things about the describe portion of the Dear Man skill, is that you have to be factual, or else it kind of just goes out the window right off the bat, which is hard to do. Although Megan has a good technique for this. I thought that was really helpful. So basically at the end, when she says does he always hit you? It's no. So she says, okay, well, can you describe specifically what he's done in the last 3 days? So she says, well, on Monday you hit me once and shoved me once. On Tuesday, you hit me twice. On Wednesday, you shoved me and hit me twice. And then we both got suspended twice for fighting each other. So that's a very tangible way of wording that. So then they go through the express component of this. Express your emotions. So she says, I feel rage. The counselor's perfect. Rage is really important. That's a really strong emotion. So that's good. Then they talk about assert. And I also really liked how they talked about this too, because Lola says, I don't ever want him to touch me again, ever. And the counselor goes really? Never touch you again? No hugs, no handshakes, no nothing? And she goes, nope, I never want him to touch me again. And the counselor's okay, perfect. Well, in that case, we'll write that down. And then they talk about how they're going to try and reinforce that behavior for the other person, right? So not just say like, you need to do this because you need to do this because it's what I want, but here's what you're going to be able to get out of the situation. And she brings cupcakes to school on occasion. And so she says, for every week that he keeps his hands off me, I'll give you a cupcake. This is really simple, a simple dear letter. So it really just is maybe like 4 or 5 sentences. And I think that that's I always write my dear letters down. I never do it verbally, which we can talk about a little bit more later on in this episode. So what I thought was really brilliant about this is instead of just give the letter to that one person, because in the story, he actually just rips it up and goes like, I don't care what this letter is. But she also gives one to the principal, to her guidance counselor, and she keeps a copy for herself. So that way there's like evidence that you're trying to do the right thing here and be skillful. And if the other person just like completely ignores you, then that's on them. And so, yeah, basically, because these stories are short, he throws out the copy, and then at some point the principal sees him like misbehaving and takes him to the office and makes him read the letter. And then he never hit her again. And then this is where I don't love how this story ends. So it says, that first week, Lola baked a dozen cupcakes. She gave one to Jimmy, one to the principal, one to the guidance counselor, and distributed the rest to the teachers. Because of the skillfulness of the letter and the cupcakes, she had support from many of the adults in her school. That's amazing. And then the last sentence is, after that first week, Lola didn't need to bake any more cupcakes. Jimmy had gotten the message. And what I don't love about that is like, she basically made a promise in her reinforce that for every week you didn't touch me, you would get a cupcake. And then after week 1, she was like, okay, we're good. And I think that it's really important for us to like continue what we promised if we expect them to continue what they promise. But that's a very specific like bone to pick with this particular chapter. How did you guys feel about this story?
I think that, the one thing that is something I think, Laurie, that you already said, which is that I think that like the real lesson here, because look, her letter it's not like you read the letter and then he does what she wants. But the real lesson here is that he looked reasonable and what she wanted was extremely clear, so that when other people had to get involved, wasn't like she looked like some sort of a crazy person who was just in a fight with another crazy person. It was easier to just sort of punish everybody or ignore it. And also, it wasn't like he could say, it wasn't like Jimmy could go to the principal and when he could call in there, be like, I don't know what she wanted. She was all over the place. It's like, no, this was extremely clear and extremely specific. And so, whether it involves going to other people or not, I think those are really valuable parts of the Dear Man. And I think also why it's important, as you said, that it not be like paragraphs and paragraphs, that it really be like 4, maybe 5 sentences. Because if you're writing more, you could probably pare it down and get more specific, which helps the other person to understand better what you're looking for. There was something else you said at the beginning, though, about manipulation. And I think that I just wanted to say really quickly, I think that like, using Dear Man to me is like the opposite of manipulation. I mean, everybody who's human, you can't go through life without wanting things and then trying to get them. And the question is, are you using methods that are sneaky or playing tricks on people, or are you in an effective way asking for what you want in a way that the other person can say yes or no? And so I would look on the Dear Man as like a substitute for manipulative tactics. And also, I would also just push back on the idea that people with BPD tend to be manipulative. I mean, I think that we can be experienced as manipulative, or I could be experienced as manipulative in the sense that like, if there was something I wanted, the actions I was taking to the person that I was, directing them at, they didn't necessarily feel terribly connected to what I wanted. And a lot of times they were out of proportion to what I wanted. But it wasn't like I was sitting there and being like, if I do this, then, it'll trick them into giving me what they wanted. A lot of times what I was doing was completely impulsive and totally out of my control. So it wasn't like I was actually even doing any planning, which is also the reason why a lot of times my reactions when I wasn't getting what I wanted, or if I was trying to make a request of something I wanted or that I wanted to say no to, it did wind up being out of proportion and not connected in a way that made it really hard for the other person to want to give me what I wanted, because a lot of times it was also hurtful to them. So I feel like the manipulative thing is something that really needs to get pushed back on, because it is, if people know about BPD, that's probably like if they had to pick one word, that's probably the only one they know about. And I just, again, not that I couldn't be experienced by someone else, someone else might feel manipulated, but, it's all about intent, I think. And Dear Man definitely helps with that.
Yeah, it's definitely all about intent. And I think part of that intent piece is also like, we're just trying to get our needs met. And the world isn't set up to get people like us our needs met. And so sometimes it might seem manipulative because we're like desperately trying to get our needs met. But that's us just trying to survive and cope and not, again, intentionally try and harm someone or be manipulative. I totally agree with you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just, and then I'll be, and then that's it, but pass the mic, as it were. But I think that I would alter that slightly for me to take a little more responsibility. And rather than saying that, like, the world isn't set up, I would say, like, my brain, before I started doing DBT, was wired to, to not go about making requests or dealing with people saying no to me in an effective way. I was not in control of my reactions in those situations and the things that my mind decided to do in those situations. It didn't get me what I wanted, and it hurt other people. So these interpersonal effectiveness skills are about, getting my mind to react in a different and more effective way that gets me what I want and also leaves other people feeling better.
The first into my mind is listening to you guys talking is saying, well, that could be a dialect. Our brains are not set up the right way and the world is not.
Yeah, the intent is there, right? Like going with the facts and then saying, like, this is what I need from this. And then the other person also has the opportunity to say, that doesn't work for me, but then that's a longer conversation. And what I find really helpful is like, it's almost like having receipts. Like, that's why I write it down, is I say this and this. And if somebody were to come back after I send a Dear Man letter, because I usually send them in writing almost exclusively for a reason. If they were to come back and say, well, I didn't agree to this, or you didn't say this, or whatever, then I could say, as per my last email, yes, I did. Or my favorite meme that I saw the other day, which was, instead of saying, as per my last email, say, sorry, if I realized you were illiterate, I would have drawn you a picture. And I laughed so hard. But it's really helpful to be, even for my own like shame spirals and validation and all this stuff, to be able to go back and read what I said and go like, did I communicate that clearly? Because I feel like my brain always second guesses what I've said or what I've done and how other people are treating me. And so I'll go like, well, maybe I wasn't clear. But if I can go back and read word for word, this is how I said this, that's really helpful. And it also says this in the book, that it's not a bad idea to work through a Dear Man letter with your counselor, with your friend, with your partner, so that you have a second set of eyes on whether or not this is describe, assert, describe, express, assert, and reinforce, or if you're just like kind of bitching at someone in writing, which are two very different things. And having a second set of eyes that's less biased is incredibly helpful for that, I find. I think I'm going to end up, I have like a bunch of Dear Man letters on my computer somewhere, like from going back like almost 10 years. I think I might put some of them on Patreon, like redacted, slightly redacted, to not like call anyone out, but just as like examples. And my examples aren't great because they are longer than they should be, right? They're not as simple as Lola's letter, which was so well done in the 5 sentences. But sometimes the context, the situations are more complicated than hers was. So maybe there is a place for slightly more complicated Dear Man.
I really agree with your idea, and I don't always do it, or I don't often do it, I should say, but writing it down, I think, also helps, because then, as part of, you're combining it with, say, a stop skill or something like that, to be able to write it down, and then, if you're looking for a good moment, wait till the next day. It's easier to go back and take a look and reevaluate than if it's just floating around in your head when you're trying to like remember how you said it. And I also don't think that, to me, like when I've done this, it's not like, I've rarely done it where I just did the Dear Man and then just read it word for word to somebody. That a lot of times it serves as a really helpful support for going into the conversation, where it's like, if I feel comfortable with these 2 or 3 points, then, if things start to go off the rails, then I can always go back to those things. Yeah, it's not that it can't get more complicated. It's just that when planning for it, I found it's helpful to be as simple as possible.
Yeah, it's definitely the most useful way of doing it, but it's also really difficult when you're like feeling so. I mean, I'm never writing a Dear Man letter when like somebody cuts me off in traffic, right? I'm usually waiting and writing a Dear Man letter when there's like a major challenge and there's a lot of complicated factors. And so that can be more difficult to distill it down. I think realistically, what the most effective way to do this would be, and I'm not saying that I've done this, would be to like, if you have multiple issues that you want addressed and you have multiple asserts, that you should probably separate those into various different Dear Mans so that it's very clear. Like, sometimes I'll do that with emailing at work. Like if I have a request about like getting data from someone and I have an HR request from the same person, I put those in two different emails so that when they like deal with one, they can deal with the other at another time, or when they're dealing with all their HR stuff. That's probably the best way of doing it with Dear Man. It's just hard sometimes when there's like, if it's with a family member and there's 35 years of context behind the scenes for you to be able to kind of like, distill that down.
Yeah, I really liked the example in here of building a deer for big requests and just like basically saying like, here, brainstorm everything, put everything down, and then go back and like circle what can I actually use? Like, what is a fact? What is an emotion? What are the like key factors of those asserts? And I think what Laurie said about like breaking it down is a great way to do it too, because people can get set in dealing with one issue and forget about dealing with another. So if you have like separate tasks and separate asks, that allows people to really like focus on one at a time instead of like piecemeal deciding on different things, which can lead to a lot of confusion. And the whole point of Dear Man is to be like specific. So trying to eliminate that confusion is really helpful.
Yeah, it's the whole point is like to take out any ambiguity of what you might need or how you're going to say it, right? Because sometimes we don't even know what we want or what we need. And that's where I find Dear Man to be so helpful is to, and I mean, to be fair, this book actually does a really good job of like the clarifying priorities, and like there's so many different components of this book where they talk about that. But when I first did DBT, for some reason, those never really stuck with me. So I sometimes need to do a Dear Man just for my own brain to figure out what do I want and what do I need and what am I willing to compromise on. And like, honestly, probably 80% of the time, the letter never gets sent, but at least I have some sort of like clarity on my end, which I find really helpful. I think that you said this in a different episode, and I can't remember which one now, but you had a good way of determining what is describe, because describe is like facts only. And that can be really hard to do because we want to say like, well, like in that story, you're always hitting me. Well, he's not always hitting you. Or you're really invalidating me. Well, what does that actually look like? And so, Megan, do you want to share how you kind of approach the describe component?
Yeah, I do remember saying that, and I probably won't say it in the exact same way, but that's okay. So in terms of when I'm doing describe, I always think of it as like, what can I tell like a judge that like a judge would like strictly make a decision on? That's because largely because of my legal background, that I think of it in that way. But trying to like really take out the emotion side of things and really like what is true no matter kind of like which way you look at it. Like if you're like the sun is round, no matter where you're looking at the sun is always going to be round. Like that was probably a bad example, but I'm thinking on my feet here. And just trying to really like limit the judgments that you're making yourself on those describes, and not like putting like the truth assertions on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think it's super important to have that. Again, it's kind of like even an outside perspective, even if it's like an imaginary outside perspective of what would he be telling, or he or she be telling me if I came in and said like, well, you're not being nice to me. Like, ma'am, that's not a fact. Go work on your case. That's ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah. Also thinking of it in terms of like, what would your like best friend tell you? Like, if you're looking at it's kind of like the same for like judgments and stuff like that, where you're like, well, I'm a horrible person. And your friend would be like, are you a horrible person? Or did you do this thing that you're now ascribing a judgment to? Did you take an extra cookie from the cookie jar that you weren't supposed to? That doesn't make you a horrible person. The fact is you took an extra cookie. The judgment is that that makes you a horrible person. And so like being kind and giving yourself the grace that like an outside opinion would give. And I think that that's in like interpersonal effectiveness or anything like that. Like assume the best from people, and like other people will be providing you that assume the best. And so giving yourself that grace when you're describing things that are happening.
Yeah, I think it's called assume good intentions. I think we did that in our last
Yeah.
episode where you're
Yeah,
trying,
yeah.
which easier said than done, but yeah, definitely important. Does anybody have like a good example of when they've used Dear Man to get something or communicate well that they want to share or comfortable sharing?
I actually wanted to ask you guys about something. I was sort of curious about some of the stuff that she has about the reinforced part of the skill. In particular, the idea of offering a quid pro quo, which actually I didn't realize it, but it actually comes up in the story where, it's not just that she's saying she's making a request and sort of including some sort of idea of why at the very least it won't hurt. There's Jimmy's not missing out on anything by not hitting her, but she actually offers him some like sort of a bribe to do what she wants. And like I had never really heard that being part of the skill or thought about that. I thought it was more sort of a conceptual thing, and I'm sort of blanking on how to make an example out of it now, but sort of like talking to your boss and being like, I would like it if I can pass on some of this stuff to a subordinate. And by the way, that'll free me up to do these other things that you really would like to have done that'll make your life easier, as opposed to being like, which now that I'm saying it, maybe that's, I don't even, I look at that as real. It's not a quid pro quo. It's not like do what I want and I'll do what you want, and I'll like give you something. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just curious. I just never really had thought about it that way. I'm curious if you guys had any thoughts of something versus like the more traditional, as I see it, view of reinforce.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
something tangible.
Yeah, I kind of found it like interesting too, because I had always thought of Dear Man in terms of like reinforce is like reinforce the good or like the net benefit of like you're doing the dishes, therefore I have more time to cook dinner or something like that. Like I'm not getting as burnt out. But I guess that is also kind of a quid pro quo in terms of like being like, I'm doing the dinner. I think we do these negotiations in day-to-day life like all the time, especially like I notice it with partners in terms of like if you walk the dog, I'll make dinner, like trying to like figure out the like balance of things. I think that you also like have to, when you're doing the art of reinforcement, do it in a way that's helping someone see the upside of doing something positive for you. Because sometimes people won't act when it's not in their own interest. And I think that that's kind of the part of the reinforce is like, well, this is actually good for you too, because blank. Whether that's your example of like, well, if I can delegate work, then I have more time for like the stuff that's at my level of work. Or whether that's like, say, like in the example, like, I'll give you a cupcake, right? Like, I think those are both influencing positive decisions. But like, say the guy in the story doesn't like cupcakes, that's not going to be a good example of reinforce because it's not going to be providing like a positive benefit for them. So I think it's a lot about reframing how the ask affects them too. And I think that kind of more the reinforce that I've kind of stuck with is like a reframe.
Yeah, I feel like the cupcake example was just for the sake of like making it very clear, like there's a tangible good that I'm providing you. But if I were to really think through that story and think about what I would probably do is reinforce if I were in that circumstance would be something along the lines of like, there's two options that I can come up with. One is like, if you can not touch me, then it is unlikely that we'll both be suspended again. Right? Because they've been suspended in the past. So that's a less tangible thing, but it's a lot more like high stakes, right? In theory, you don't want to be suspended. It's going to be on your academic record. It's going to cause problems in the future. So that would be like a more, what I would consider like a classic Dear Man kind of reinforce, or a reinforce. And I've used this in Dear Mans before in other ways. Is, if you're able to not touch me at all, we can maintain some sort of a friendship if you can follow these boundaries. But if not, I'm out. And those are probably more realistic Dear Man reinforces, I would think, in that context, but just harder to explain in a book because a cupcake is like a very nice, tangible, here, eat this cupcake.
Yeah, I like those examples, Laurie, because I think that also context of the benefit to the other person is like so important, because both of those are like intangibles, but both of those, like, for them to work, the other person has to ascribe some sort of value to it, right? Because like in the story, if he's like, I don't care about getting suspended, I would rather be suspended, then he's going to be like, that's not a motivation for me. Or like having the reinforced be like, we can maintain a friendship or a relationship if this happens. If somebody doesn't value the relationship, then that's not going to provide them a reason to do that. So I think a lot of this is like thinking as well in terms of like, what is the value to the other person? And I think that was back in interpersonal effectiveness, saying like, what is the like most important value to them, like the relationship, and I'm gonna blank on the other two right now, but or the objective or the like emotion, and trying to figure out what is the like most effective reinforce.
That's a great tie into the episode we did last. So it's, how do I want to feel about myself? What do I want from this interaction? And how do I want this person to feel about me? And if those, like that's about clarifying your own priorities. But if you know them well enough to know what their priorities are, or you could ask them what their priorities are too. For example, the most recent Dear Man letter I sent was to a close family member, and I knew that the most important thing for them was to maintain some sort of a relationship, like any relationship at all. And so for me, I was able to say like exactly what I said earlier around, if you can follow these things that I need, we can have a relationship that is minimal, but at least it exists. Otherwise, I'm out completely and I can't do this. And they've been able to mostly follow those kind of requirements, which has genuinely helped the relationship, because I'm not feeling smothered or that my boundaries are being disrespected. And I think that they probably feel very similarly, because at least they're feeling like they had some kind of say in like how this would go, because I knew what their long-term goal was. I wanted to just quickly talk about the man bit, because it's very funny to me that it's not in this book. And I don't think it comes up later, but correct me if I'm wrong. So Dave, go ahead.
I mean, I think that if you look at page 126.
Yeah. I did like,
this is where the man and the give and the fast are. I mean, she doesn't cover all of it, and it's not as organized, but I haven't checked it one-to-one, but I think it does cover some of the basic ideas.
Yeah, I agree with you. I kind of felt the same way, but I feel like, again, love this book, don't get me wrong. And I'm sure Diana is going to listen to this, and I'm not criticizing you, Diana, but I think that having the man, the give and the fast skill would have been helpful for people that need that structure. Because, for example, like the man, and part of Dear Man is mindfulness. So being mindful of your goal means not getting sidetracked or distracted by other issues. I find that really important for me, because that's why I write it down. If I go into a conversation especially with people that you often need to write Dear Mans about or for, they're trying to bring in all these other, well, what about that time I did XYZ? That was really nice of me. And you're like, right, but that's not the point. And so kind of continuously, like we can talk about that another time. Right now we're talking about this. I find that really helpful. Appear confident, that's the A. Use body language to show confidence, even if you don't feel like it. And then negotiate. So know the limits of what you're willing to accept, but be willing to compromise within them. And I don't know. I don't feel like on page 126 that was necessarily covered in that clear of a way.
I don't think those were covered at all. No, I think you're right. She's just sort of skipped the man entirely.
Yeah. And I think skipped give and fast as well. Yeah.
Well, I think I think that the I is interested, and no apologies is definitely one of those. Validation is the V in give, I think. So
right.
It does cover some of them, but it certainly doesn't cover them all. And I agree with you that like each of those I think is extremely important. So it is a little bit of a shame that those acronyms don't come up at all. Certainly there could have been a page that at least like sort of laid those out.
Yeah, so just because I have it up here. So relationship effectiveness is the give skill. So be gentle, act interested. I don't love act interested, but anyways, validate and easy manner. What does that mean?
It means just like don't be like intense. Don't be like in their face. Don't be, just like act be like relaxed as you can.
Right. Tell somebody with borderline to not seem intense. Okay. But yeah, it says, present in a flexible, calm demeanor, relax your muscles in your body, look relaxed. And then fair is for maintaining self-respect. So this one actually came up to me when I was doing that big Dear Man that I was just talking about. And somebody in Super Feelers reminded me of this skill that I had completely forgotten. And I thought it was really important. So fair, so fast. So fair, be fair and objective in your description and requests. That's kind of just like reiterating the Dear Man, I feel like. Check the facts. No apologies. Don't apologize for asserting yourself. This one does come up here, to be fair, on page 126. Don't apologize for asserting yourself or making a request. Do not apologize for the way you feel or having a different point of view. And maybe it's just because I'm Canadian, or maybe it's because I have BPD, or maybe it's just who I am as a person, but I apologize all the time. Like, I apologize for things that I didn't do. And it's like actually a problem for me. I think it's actually part of the like kind of OCD traits that I have of like, I'm so sorry. Like, did I offend you? Or like, am I a bad person? Like, I'm really sorry if I am, or anything like that. And I find that really hard. Stick to your values. So know what your personal values, ethics, and morals are, which is a whole thing in itself. And do not compromise them for the sake of avoiding conflict or appeasing others. That's not really in here either. And then truthfulness, stick to the facts and avoid exaggerating, embellishing, or making personal judgments. Yeah, rather than saying he was totally rude, reinstate the assumption factually. He kept interrupting others while they were speaking. So, I mean, that comes up, but I think the fair, the stick to your values, and basically all of give aren't in this book that we've seen so far. And I don't think they're their own chapters, which personally I think they should be.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Superfeeler podcast. Today's episode was recorded on the unceded and traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me reach more listeners like you, and we're always looking for improving the podcast. Remember, you can always stay connected with me on social media. You can follow us. The show notes will have all of the details for Instagram profiles. If you want to support the podcast and help me continue to bring great content, please consider joining the Superfeeler community on Patreon. Your support really means the world to me, and there's a variety of different options for support, including some free ones. For all information about the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support that we run, including upcoming events and resources, head over to Eventbrite or laurieedmondson.com for more information. And if you have a topic that you want me to cover or a guest you'd love to hear from, please send me the suggestions. Always happy to hear them. Until next time, keep on super feeling and living authentically, This is Laurie signing off of the Super Feeler podcast.